Good evening. Good evening. My name is Shuman Basar, and on behalf of Ibraaz, welcome to the second in the series Technology and Power, organized by Jaya Klara Brekke, with today's guests Alia Al Ghussain and Mahmoudi. If I can ask you all to turn your phones to silent right now, and should you wish to tag us, the handle is @Ibraaz London. And if you haven't done already, please sign up to the newsletter at ibraaz.org, where you will be kept up to date on all the various activities. Our talk this evening is taking place inside Ibrahim Mahama's Parliament of Ghosts, a potent setting that brings together colonial histories, reverse restitution, and capital redistribution through materials that have traveled across memories, violences, and meanings. There are some seats at the front if you'd like to advance. So, not a day goes by without a slew of stories that make the science fiction of yesterday seem quaint in comparison. Water becomes more valuable as the cooling needs for server farms that churn 1 billion chat requests per second, which apparently induces psychoses at a species level. Just a few days ago, Jeff Bezos said that these server farms need to be relocated to the moon and that we have no choice. So it is therefore clear that technology and power are used interchangeably today, not only as words, but as verbs. The Palestine Laboratory, as Anthony Lowenstein put it in his book, is a petri dish of software and hard power that is exported the world over through our dopamine-driven devices, whose conflict materials fuel other genocides in the continent of Africa. And it is against this very entire backdrop that we invited Jaya to put together a series of conversations about the fraught, intimate, and embedded relationships between technology and power. And, crucially, to identify forces within the tech sphere that imagine alternatives to the kind of tech hegemony that has now become the new normal. The sheer kind of turnout and the amazing sign-up rates, I think, point to the fact that this is a topic that is on many of our minds today. I'd also like to invite you to tomorrow's session, which is a close cousin to this series. It's called Slop Making Sense, with Al-Hassan Alwan, also known as Post, and Gunseli Yalchinkaya, where we will be assessing the power of AI-generated slop as it circulates psychically and politically. Lastly, my huge thanks to the entire Ibraaz team for putting this all together, especially to Louise, Barney, Fiona, and the whole VE team. I will wrap up here. Please give a huge warm round of applause and welcome to Jaya, Matt, and Alia. Thank you so much.
Hello. Is my microphone working? Yes, now it's working. Wonderful to see everybody here tonight. And welcome to the second in a series of what I feel are incredibly urgent discussions on the topic of technology and power. I myself work in the tech industry, and I think I speak on behalf of many people in the tech industry today when I say that it is a very strange place to work and kind of raising questions every day on what are we really doing here and what really matters in the tech world today. How can we change? How can we shift the direction that this ship is moving in? So this series has been developed in response to a profound shift that's been building for some time. Technology and power has obviously always been very closely intertwined, but the role of technology today is actually significantly different than it has been historically before. It's becoming a form of ideology in its own right, and basically being far more than just the tools to achieve things. So we kickstarted this discussion series in October. It was, again, a packed house. Really wonderful people joined us. And the focus of the first session was on quantum science. And the reason why I wanted to start off with quantum science is because a series like this can easily become, a little bit of a form of macabre infotainment, right? Where we all kind of look at the horrible things that are unfolding in the world. We can get a bit of an adrenaline kick out of saying, oh, how bad is it? How terrible is it? But the actual, deeper effect that it has on us as human beings and as a community is quite a pacifying effect. It's a disempowering feeling to look at what's happening in the world of technology today. And I don't want people to walk away from these sessions in that state of mind. We're at a moment that crucially really requires people to get organized, to do something about the situation that's facing us. So I wanted to start off with quantum science because it is a set of technologies that, as we found out in the first session, doesn't really have the evil quite there yet, right? It still has a bit of a magic, kind of early stage, deep research, set of technologies that also has quite interesting liberatory influences on philosophy. And our guest at that time, Konstantinos, coined the term Q-punk. So it was a kind of somewhat of a hopeful session that I'm hoping has kind of lined our stomachs and our minds and our kind of emotional space somewhat for the topic of today. Where we're turning towards, really the kind of like frenzied heart of, the intersection of power and technology, namely artificial intelligence. And we're going to look at artificial intelligence through the lens of human rights. And I want to kind of position human rights here not as a kind of afterthought or a blocker on innovation, but really the fundamental requirement for whether we consider a technology to work or not. And that is a challenge to, a lot of the let's say the kind of discourse that big tech really wants to drive today, positioning, effectively innovation and technology against human rights in many ways. So yeah, I do have two incredible guests with me here to speak on this topic, Alia Al Ghussain and Mahmoudi. But before we turn over to you guys, if you'll allow me 10 minutes to just set the scene. And then we can kind of dive into the important work that you're doing and your perspectives on the topic. So first of all, to start off kind of like on a very fundamental level, artificial intelligence is, in a sense, proposing a radical new way of making sense of the world. And this new way of making sense of the world comes very much from the history of the AI industry as intertwined with the big tech takeover of the internet. And what I mean here is a kind of prehistory of mass surveillance online, the extraction of data, and then this question of how do we monetize this data. And what happens in artificial intelligence is almost like a little bit of a kind of flipping of, how we normally engage with the world, where, usually, as we move about, there might be something that we find important or that matters to us, and then we want to do something about this, and, we're behaving as human beings, looking at the world, being curious about the world. With artificial intelligence, what's happening is somewhat of a kind of almost delegation of the question of what matters to a data set and statistical analysis of that data set, where artificial intelligence surfaces patterns in the data set and then uses those patterns in various ways to kind of automate different things. So in the case of large language models or generative AI, it's, surfacing patterns in kind of the relationship between words and letters, so you can generate, a sentence or a paragraph. In the case of generating images, it's, predicting what should the next pixel be, and so on and so forth. So of course, there is a ugly prehistory to where the artificial intelligence industry has come out, but there's also somewhat of a kind of reappropriation that is happening. You have a lot of great artists and really important research groups that are looking into interesting, fascinating, and important ways of using artificial intelligence. This was a hugely influential report that came out from an indigenous group across Australia, United States, and the Pacific that put together some research on how to use artificial intelligence in interesting ways to maintain languages and also to really kind of propagate certain cosmologies and knowledge systems that were otherwise being lost. And I mention this also because they have a very, very important kind of understanding of the idea of abundant intelligences, many different epistemologies, many different knowledge constructs, many different cosmologies. And that stands in stark contrast to the idea of singularity and the idea of a kind of mega intelligence that is propelling a lot of the AI race today. So to get to the AI race, 2025, this year, has been probably the most frenzied ever in the world of artificial intelligence. And the year started off with the release of DeepSeek, China's large language model that challenged a lot of the ideas that bigger is better, and also really lit a fire under the bums of US big tech in a sense. And that fire has kind of been ripping through companies and markets ever since. Very soon after the release of DeepSeek, we saw Google dealing the final death blow to its "Don't be evil" motto by modifying their ethical guidelines. And they got rid of a policy to do no harm, basically opening cloud and AI capabilities for use in automated weapon systems. And of course, we've seen that propagate across into military use ever since. And I think we're going to get into that in the session. This race has also been driving a kind of huge rush that shifted effectively big tech to gigatech. This is a kind of slide that Zuckerberg was very proud to showcase about his, dream Hyperion data center and just how big it is in comparison to Manhattan. We heard Shumon mentioned earlier the just sheer insane amount of energy that's required and water that's required to maintain these data centers. And of course, what we're starting to see, especially this past week, is that this kind of, shift from big tech to gigatech is starting to look very much like a bubble. When we say gigatech, we don't just mean that, existing companies are throwing more money, more capital than ever before into the kind of AI race and into their AI capabilities, but also that these companies are starting to form conglomerates. So, we have this like strange, I'm not the only one that's called it a circle jerk happening among companies where, you're throwing, contracts around with, 400 billions of dollars worth of, NVIDIA chips to OpenAI in exchange for, other services and so on. So you have this kind of consolidation, in a sense, of the US tech industry. That consolidation is driving huge amounts of capital and investment, not just in that circle jerk kind of round thing, but you have a lot of like external funding coming into the space as well. Just last week we did see, after NVIDIA became the world's first $1 trillion company and is effectively actually the most valuable company in the world today, their valuation dropped $500 billion in just a week after, infamous Michael Burry, an investor that actually foresaw the subprime mortgage crisis back in 2008, shorted the AI market, and that led to divestment from SoftBank and a number of other people. So it's starting to look like a bubble, it's starting to behave a bit like a bubble. It's not clear whether the actual crash is happening right now. But there is this consolidation into gigatech, and we're seeing, that consolidation not just happen to drive finance, but it's also consolidating behind an ideology. And that ideology I really want to kind of spend a little bit of time on as well. We see kind of hints of it here in this quote by NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, when he says that the West, including the US and the UK, is being held back by cynicism. We need more optimism, and the use of the word optimism here is also a clear reference to venture capital, Andreessen Horowitz and their Techno-Optimist manifesto that came out a couple years ago. And really, they're doing some clever communications here, right? Where they're kind of effectively making it seem that any, criticism of the way that AI is rolling out today is cynicism. It's holding back innovation, right? Which again, I really, really want to emphasize, we have to challenge that and actually point to the fact that really what's happening is malfunctioning technology, badly built technology, and that's what we're criticizing. So this ideology that's really kind of driving, it's really consolidating in big tech, is leading to incredible amounts of dehumanization. This AI race is coming at huge costs, both in terms of human lives and in terms of the environment. And is really a sign of sheer neglect, sheer laziness, and badly built tech. And again, they're really trying to drive a narrative here around the technology being, any critique of the way that they're doing things being kind of what holds back innovation when it's pure lies. The ideology runs a little bit deeper than that, and I'm coming to the end here of the setting of the scene. The ideology, we've got Peter Thiel here, who is an American venture capitalist behind PayPal and behind Palantir, and also behind J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. When he says that technology is this incredible alternative to politics, what he's saying is, let's replace democracy with our infrastructure, and our infrastructure of governance and control. And that's what their plan is, that's what they're doing in the United States very, very clearly, and that's what they're trying to do in Europe and many other parts of the world also. Again, they are fantastic at communicating. A quote like this, technology is an incredible alternative to politics. He's saying politics instead of democracy, right? Which is clever, because a lot of people are disheartened by politics in this day and age. A lot of people have experiences of lies from the political class, of institutions failing them. And so there's a lot of people that are upset with politics. And here comes a bunch of people that say we can build great tech to replace it, and everything will just work so much better. It's a clever twist on words. It's a clever piece of communication. Again, I want to say it's very, very important to understand that when they say technology, they're not talking about our tech. They're talking about their tech. They're talking about their capacity to govern and control with no democratic oversight. So this is, some of the kind of kingmakers, let's say, behind that are really driving this narrative. This is a mapping project that a number of friends have been working on called the authoritarianstack.info. A quote from there: Silicon Valley is no longer building apps; they're building empires. That's their explicit program. That ideology is, at an ideological level, what the aim is really is to undermine trust and faith in humanity, in relationships between people, in our ability to govern, and to replace that, trust and that social fabric, let's say, replace that glue with technologies that they control. And so I found this quote very fascinating that Miyazaki, from Miyazaki in 2016, when he encountered kind of generative AI in his studio. He's saying we humans are losing faith in ourselves, and I think there is something interesting there. So on that note, I'm going to turn to the two of you, and I'm so happy that you're here. So let me first introduce Alia Al Ghussain. You're a researcher and advisor on technology and human rights at Amnesty International. Your focus is on big tech accountability, working primarily on algorithmic amplification and online hate. Welcome. Do you want to kind of just introduce a little bit the work that you've been doing recently, or, even further? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I can hear me too now. Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and also thanks everyone for being here. It's really great when these rooms are really packed out, because it feels like there's so much energy to have these kinds of conversations, even though it can also feel a bit like everything's really scary, which it is. But in these spaces where we can come together, we can, talk about it, and this is how we will organize against the kind of current reality. I work as a researcher and advisor on tech and human rights, focusing mostly on big tech. I'm in the big tech accountability team at Amnesty International, which I think is fairly self-explanatory from the name what that team is about. But I think there's a few things about our work that, at least when I started in the team a few years ago, felt like very unique in the space of tech and human rights, which was that rather than talking about content that was bad or harmful in isolation, we always talked and still do talk about the business model that underpins the platforms. So the kind of companies that I mostly work on are like Meta, X, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, Google, TikTok, like all of those the really big guys. But they all have a very similar business model, which has been deliberately designed in such a way. And we refer to that as a surveillance-based business model, which is like kind of like, I sometimes think, I used to think, now I know more. I'm like, no, it's true. I used to think it sounded really like, ooh, conspiratorial, but actually it's quite a simple explanation of how the platforms operate, which is that they have been designed in a way where they are totally reliant on targeted advertising for their revenue. Like that's how these companies make their money. And what that has meant is that they have designed their platforms in such a way as to optimize for data collection. And the way that they'll do that is to show you things that you will engage with, whether that's because you like it, because you don't like it, as long as you're going to like look at it, comment on it, whatever, interact with the content, they are able to keep you on the platform for longer, and they're able to continue to gather data about you so that they can like find out, I don't know, what you're thinking about or interested in, and then send you targeted ads. And I think that's something that, I see people like nodding their heads in the audience. Really a few years ago, people would be like, what are you talking about? Or I had a friend say to me, like, but I like the targeted ads. And I was like, that's why it's bad. Like, think about how they know that you need new trainers. Like, actually, if you deep it, it's really creepy. But so that's kind of the emphasis that we've always put in our work, is that this business model is inherently incompatible with human rights. Like, it has not been designed or developed with any human rights considerations whatsoever. The right to privacy is a very obvious one, the right to freedom of expression, the right to non-discrimination, and all of those rights that are then kind of secondarily impacted. It's like everything that we hold dear is kind of made into fodder for like data collection, and actually, and in doing that, our rights are being put at risk by these companies we don't really have a choice but to interact with. And when we interact with them, they don't give us a choice about how much data we want to give them or not, right? So it's a really kind of, it's like we're in a trap, basically. It's been designed that way. And so the kind of link then to algorithmic amplification of hate, which I think I'll also talk about a bit more later, is that the algorithmic boosting of content is kind of like agnostic, like it doesn't, which actually sometimes the companies will even say, like in the inquests into Molly Russell's death, who was a girl who died in this country when she was a teenager after being shown lots of pro-suicide content on Instagram. Someone from Instagram was in the inquest and said, well, it's content agnostic, which I think she thought sounded like it was a good thing. But in reality, what that means is that content that is inciting violence, that is targeting marginalized communities, that is playing on people's sort of social and political vulnerabilities, will get boosted because people will interact with it. And we have seen this happen over and over and over again in so many different contexts. But I think where we see it happen so often and so acutely is in global majority countries. And in those contexts, in contexts where there's conflict, the platforms operate with so little regard for what impact they're having. Facebook did it in Myanmar in 2017. That community, the Rohingya community, is still pursuing Facebook for reparations and for remedy. The same thing happened in Ethiopia during the conflict in northern Tigray. In both of those situations, Facebook knew what was happening, knew that it was having some impact, and chose to do nothing. And that's something that we see in those companies, over and over and over again. And I think that, there's obviously reasons why those decisions are being made, and it's because, the global majority markets are, that's their language, markets are big and important markets, but not markets with any political power. And if you think about the difference in Facebook's response to the coup in the US versus how it responds in the global majority, it's just incredibly telling. And I feel like as time has gone on, as we have become more familiar with these platforms, we're also seeing the mask really come off in the decisions that they make, and we're finding out more information about them. And the other thing that I also, in talking about the mask off, wanted to just mention is that, as I said, I think the most acute harms, happen in the global majority. Unfortunately, that's very often the case, particularly with kind of corporate negligence, which is certainly what's happened in the case of Myanmar and in Ethiopia and many others, but also marginalized communities in the global north, particularly if they're not English-speaking countries, are also really affected by these algorithms and this business model. So, for example, I recently did some research on anti-LGBTI content on Twitter, X, in Poland, and the content is rife, which I'm sure doesn't surprise anyone, but what is more surprising is that X has two Polish-speaking content moderators and over 5 million users in the country, and it's insane. And they reported that it was good because in their previous transparency report from 2024, they had only had one, and it's that person must have a really stressful job, if nothing else. But I think that's really important to highlight because it's so tempting to be oh, that's a problem that happens over there, but it doesn't. It happens here. It happens. Anyone who's marginalized in any way is at risk, is being put at risk by these companies. And I think, to take an example from this country, the really obvious one is, of course, X's contribution to content that was targeting Muslims, it was, spreading disinformation after the terrible killings of those 3 girls in Southport in 2024, and sparked racist riots. And again, very little was done by the platform at the time. And I think, and we're seeing this mask-off moment in terms of also the role that these companies are now playing in kind of facilitating authoritarianism and aligning themselves with authoritarian figures. I mean, the inauguration photo, Donald Trump's inauguration photo, I feel is just such a good example of that, and it's something people always point to, it's literally, you can see these people would have not touched Donald Trump with a barge pole a few years ago, but now that it's in their interest, apart from Elon Musk, but now that it's in their interest, of course, they're kind of all about being in his basically currying favor with him. But it's not only happening in that way. Meta recently made policy changes, and really the kind of fact checkers, they're getting rid of fact checkers in the US. That really made the headlines, but actually the more frightening change was their content policy changes, which basically now say, it's okay to kind of say things trans people are weird, or maybe being gay is a mental illness on the platform, and that's won't be taken down. And that's a global change that happened like this as soon as it was announced. And Meta's oversight was really bad before, but now it's even worse. And I think given this is a company that has contributed to atrocity crimes in several countries, that is really, really concerning for that reason, but also because of what it's normalizing across the world, that kind of discourse. I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I think in making those changes and in the way that the kind of CEOs of these companies have like cozied up in this really gross way to Donald Trump, it's clearer than ever that the way that these companies operate is a choice. Like, I think they often want us to think it's inevitable, that like, well, you don't know how else it would work, or it couldn't work any other way. But it's not true, because they make decisions to change how they operate all the time, but then they kind of don't like any sort of challenge to things coming from us, like from normal people, from civil society groups. They're like, no, we couldn't change it. But when they want to change things, they can, and they do. And in knowing that it's a choice, it means it can also be unmade, and it can be done differently, and it can be redesigned. Like, these things are not impossible, actually. And a company that understands its own technology should really be able to make it more in line with human rights and to take their human rights responsibilities into account. And I think in this era of AI hype, it's really important, because I feel like we made this mistake with social media platforms where we were like, yeah, it's probably fine. Like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg seems like he's like, I don't know, did he ever seem fine? Well, you know, it was like, he seemed kind of harmless maybe for a time. And we really let them develop their platforms like without any oversight. It's like truly the Wild West, like in terms of corporate development. But now we know better now, and many of these companies are also pushing the AI bubble and getting involved and saying like this. They're seeing this as an evolution of their business model, and we know that it's what the things that they do are a choice, and we also know that they can't be trusted. And so I guess I'll end there, because I know that we have more things to talk about. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. There was so much there that we need to dig into a little bit more. I'm going to attempt a segue over to you, Matt, from that. So there's thinking a little bit deeper about the things that you were just saying, Alia. The dynamic goes a little bit something like this. There's the targeting of marginalized communities by platforms. And that targeting happens partially also to drive engagement, right? And is also partially just through neglect, as you mentioned, and lack of investment. That engagement, meanwhile, generates data, so they're of course happy. So we push a few buttons, make people really annoyed and pissed off with each other. When they start hating each other, they start posting more. Great for our KPIs. Then we get loads of data. That data can then become training data that goes into artificial intelligence. And in a sense, you've got kind of automated bigotry at that point. Is that like a fair summary, Matt, of some of the work that you've been looking into? And let me just first do a kind of proper introduction to who you are. Matt Mahmoudi is assistant professor at digital humanities at the University of Cambridge. Also a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International. And at Amnesty has led research and advocacy work on AI-driven surveillance by the NYPD, which we're going to get into a little bit more detail of. NYPD surveillance machine, and also looking at automated apartheid in occupied Palestinian territory. Mahmoudi's research focuses on redlining and resistance in digital cities and the smart reproduction of racial capitalism. So, yeah, tell us a bit about your work.
I think Alia sort of summarized the cursed machinery that brings all of the raw materials in motion towards the bigoted and racialized ends of, I think, ultimately domination and destruction, but we can get into that in a sec. I want to start with a quote, paraphrased maybe slightly, by Alex Karp in a quarterly earnings call in 2024, where he said something to the effect of, our mission at Palantir is really to expand and ensure the longevity of Western civilization, and if we have to kill people in the process, so be it. Right? And this is before the second Trump administration, but as Alia said, not only is the mask off, but actually it's been incubating for a while, because Palantir is just the symptom of a larger issue around the use of these tropes of a clash of civilization, of racialization, of dominance, of hegemony that has played a massive role in exactly how the tech sector and Silicon Valley actors themselves found rationale for their existence in the first place. And that's not just going back to their military starting point. It's also going back to a much longer history of the formation of racial capitalism, which I will abridge to the best of my ability. I think just to start with a few things here, it's really interesting to pay attention to this part of the surveillance business model that Alia talks about, which fundamentally is wound up with thinking about what is it that companies are extracting values from and how. And as we've just discussed, the chasms that are created between people that often hinge themselves on classifications of race and otherness is such an important driver of exactly how these companies derive profits and derive engagement, and KPIs go right up. And so it shouldn't be a surprise then that there is nothing new about how capitalism itself hinges on racial tropes and racial cleavages in order to expand and lead to the profit accumulation and accumulation of capital that now is still at the bedrock of how Silicon Valley functions. Two particular modes of subjugation that I've been interested in tracing historically from the early formation of racial capitalism right into this moment of how racial capitalism is reinvigorated through Silicon Valley actors is how the functions of categorization, that is racial categorization, and racial containment happens, right? How is it that we're told that we're of particular races and that we're contained either in space, through the enclosure laws for literally working the land in indentured ways for free labor, how we come to occupy particular socioeconomic echelons of society to enable, as it were, the slave owner and the firm holder and the overseer to derive profit from our actions. And also how that happens digitally, right? We're categorized digitally, either as particular types of consumers with particular proclivities, particular types of consumers who might be liberal, who might be interested in social justice things, who might be refugees, who might be black, who might be brown, and who therefore might benefit off of being either subjected to particular content or who themselves could serve as the rationale for the deployment of particular technologies. And this is one trend that I've observed in my work academically, that oftentimes in the Silicon Valley world, especially when it comes to technologies that are AI-driven, you see either a rationale of almost a humanitarian needy person or group that requires your technology in order to ensure their safety. Cue every AI firm that has ever said that they're finding missing children. Or they'll appeal to this notion that there are so many terrorists out there who are trying to get either what you have, or trying to take your jobs, or trying to steal your children, or trying to invade your borders, and we're going to deliver predictive technologies that are going to help find them and stop them from doing so. So it works along this vector, right, of either a humanitarian needy group or person, or a threat who is often racialized, who is often a terrorist, and it plays on tropes that we've seen time and time again. In biblical imagery, going back 500 years in the Encyclopedia Britannica, there were imageries of Jewish people, of black people who were, portrayed as feeble, feminine, devilish, engaged in behavior that would be seen as deviant at the time. And those same tropes were used to justify the echelons in society that they occupied. These aren't people who deserve to be remunerated for their work. They ought to do this work in order to absolve themselves of the very sin of existence. The British census in India, right? The ways in which the British Empire effectively used this false notion of numbers equal control to try and create neat categories of people to try and communicate an illusion that they knew these people and that the colonial subject was knowable to them and therefore could be controlled, and therefore they could use numbers to describe how these individuals, and this is in sort of a proto-eugenicist manner, don't deserve to be treated as human beings. They're effectively dehumanized through enumeration strategies. The invention of the passport to try and sort of tie you down to a particular identity and to a particular set of privileges, a constant attempt at trying to make you knowable to the state, and in turn to also those companies that provide the raw materials for the creation of those ID systems. The Hollerith punch card system, which is the system that was used and developed by IBM to literally sort out Jewish people into concentration camps during Nazi Germany. This is the IBM that is now still continuing to exist and developing the IBM Watson computer, and that still provides much of the knowledge base upon which most artificial intelligence tools base themselves, including the very target acquisition systems that we might think of as playing a role in facilitating the genocide in Gaza. I'm thinking about the village files that were developed in part through the support of Britain by the Zionist movement in Palestine. There are a number of different means through which historically we continue to see categorization and containment play a role in the construction of a racialized other or a needy other on whose backs profit can be extracted. And I've been interested in seeing how this in particular plays a role amongst unruly bodies and bodies that are seen as uncontainable in some way or shape, right? Often that comes in the form of undocumented immigrants. I've been interested in particular in tracing how so much of the Silicon Valley industrial complex has been wound up with thinking about, what's the next AI tool that they can develop to help find people that are, coming through the southern border and doing all the jobs that, regular Americans don't want to do. Right through to finding, people that now are being deemed to be anti-Semites. In the context of the protests in solidarity with Palestine in the US, we see increasingly massive amounts of products that are being developed and sold to the US government under the auspices of being able to determine who has engaged in speech, expression, assembly that could be seen as anti-Semitic and therefore a pretext for a revocation of a visa or deportation or detention. You will all have heard of the case of Mahmoud Khalil, who was a Columbia student who was arrested in the middle of the night, detained and held by ICE officers, in part through the catch and revoke system, which is this policy that the State Department rolled out that uses AI to scour social media and to scour other databases for a notion of what it considers anti-Semitic speech, but which really is just code for pro-Palestine, potentially anti-US, potentially critical. And so there's this constant logic that drives so much of this industry that I think is about preempting deviance, and that I think is fundamentally insisting that deviance is itself heinous, and that vast capital should be mobilized to end it in some way, right? Again, we see this play a role in particular in unruly bodies, moving bodies, but we also see it in security logics with roots in settler colonial control. And you can see those kind of logics play out everywhere from the West Bank, Gaza, the ways in which, in particular, facial recognition technologies are being used to literally restrict the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank, under the auspices of effectively reinforcing aspects of apartheid that are wound up with segregation, fragmentation, making life strategically precarious and impossible in particular areas that are of interest to settler communities and illegal settler communities and Israeli authorities. But we also see it play out in the ways in which the same logics and controls and technologies are used against, say, Black Lives Matter protesters in New York City, against the farmer protesters in India. It's similar modes of control that realize themselves on the back of a racialized trope or threat and then become mobilized fundamentally to restrict movement and foreclose possibilities for resistance. Anyway, been thinking about these things a lot more these days as every city seems to be turning towards smart technologies and as more and more cities are using those very infrastructures to clamp down on Palestine protesters and expression in particular.
Yep. Wow, okay, again, there's so many things that we should unpack there. I think especially one thing I would like to get into in a minute is this kind of resurgence of pseudosciences that's happening around artificial intelligence. You mentioned eugenics and phrenology, but before we get there, maybe, again, if we can kind of go a little bit like big picture, a little bit kind of back to basics and talk a little bit about artificial intelligence in the sense of just raw capacity. What is it that artificial intelligence really is doing that's attracting these, billions of dollars of investment? What is it that it does for companies, for governments, that they're willing to put so much behind it? And also, what is the type of new types of power that it's unleashing, I suppose. So I think both of you can definitely speak to that.
I mean, I guess, I think for companies and for governments, it is allowing them to evade responsibility for decisions that they have made. So in the way that, Facebook can say, oh, it's just the algorithm, like we can't do anything about that. When the Danish government uses AI to kind of try and catch false benefits claimants, and turns out actually they're doing that in quite a racist way, they can also say, oh, but that was the AI and it wasn't. And I think it really allows people actually of all kinds, but companies and governments to kind of shed this idea that they have to be responsible for things, that they have to make decisions about things, and they can kind of like outsource their decision making. In theory or in practice, of course, they are still making the decisions, but I think it really gives them this extra layer of distance between them and the decision, and then them and people. And so I think that's really, in my view, and thinking about it particularly from like a big tech angle, I think that is why they're so interested in kind of continuing down this route. And I think that appeals, it appeals to a lot of their allies as well.
Absolutely, and I think to build off of that as well, a great colleague of ours, Alex Dunn, has previously talked about this notion of magic capital, and I think AI really does occupy that space in also the minds of governments. That there's just this place in which you can put all of your hopes and dreams, and it's called AI. And if you just hope and dream hard enough and call it AI, then it will create growth. And also, it will solve all of your complex social, political, and economic issues, since the dawn of time. Meredith Broussard refers to this as techno-chauvinism, right? In part, this idea that we have a very chauvinistic approach to technology. And I think that is very true right now, in which we're observing governments pour millions, billions of pounds into data centers under the auspices that these, massive structures are going to bring a boatload of jobs. They're going to create infrastructure like you've never seen before. They're going to solve healthcare. They're going to solve the environmental issues. Once they've killed us all in the process, but never mind. Once your houses are all under either water or severe drought, it will figure out how to fix it. These are the hopes and dreams, the magic capital that are playing out. But in reality, as Jaya was also talking about before, we're witnessing a bubble on steroids that's just waiting to collapse at any moment. At no point do these governments have to actually come out and make a political stake and say, we are investing in healthcare, or we are investing in communities, or we are investing in real notions of safety, not just the ones that appeal to high fantasies of predictive crime, right? And they don't have to do that, because by using AI, they can appeal to something that they consider fundamentally apolitical. It's a technology. It's neutral. It has no place in politics. It's about scientific progress. And if you're not on this boat, then you're falling behind.
Can I just add quickly? I think that actually one of the places where it's so obvious and so scary is climate issues. Like, people in government will say things like, we'll just get the AI to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. Like, that's actually what people who should know, or like, we'll just ask the AI to make the planes not run on fossil fuel. Like, okay, great, and how's the AI going to do that? Like, what do you think the AI is? And and instead they're building data centers, which are so the last thing that we need in terms of their impact on the climate. But that is also being fed by the companies. Like Sam Altman is like, guys, I know climate's really scary, but don't worry, because AI, soon there's going to be this thing called AGI, and that's going to be basically this massive supercomputer, and it's going to fix the world, and we'll just ask the AGI, how do you fix the climate crisis, and it will do it. And that is actually like a thing that policymakers believe is going to happen, at all, which some people believe in AGI. Like, I personally don't believe in AGI. I don't think it's going to happen. Sorry if that's upsetting for anyone in the room. But also, so that's A. And B, that if it will happen before everyone's already dead, which I think, like, those two things feel really unlikely, and it's really frightening that that's, like, the issue where I think AI and those logics has really taken a hold, because people don't want to actually say, like, we need to live differently, and take the responsibility for saying that and for implementing policies, thinking up policies and implementing them. And I think it's important to say that, particularly now, because COP is happening, and the outlook for that is not amazing. And I think we should think about how AI is also playing into those discussions, because it's not really in the coverage, but that behind the scenes there's been lobbying by these companies, and that they'll have people there who are talking to the kind of state officials and things like that too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just the fact that there is so little participation in COP this time, at the same time as I mentioned earlier, the most valuable company in the world is the chip provider to the AI industry. It just seems like the focus is completely out of whack. So in the last session, we had this recurring question that always comes up when it comes to technology, around neutrality, right? This idea that technology is a tool and you can use it for lots of different things, and those things can be good or bad, but effectively it's neutral. I'm, of course, a social scientist. I argued against that. I have various reasons for why I'm thinking that's not the case. Technologies, they have affordances. There are certain things that they make easier to do and other things that they make harder to do. And there's that other saying that's like, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So coming back to also this question of pseudoscience is, like, is there, what is the affordances of AI? Is there something, and why have pseudosciences kind of come up in and around the topic of artificial intelligence? Is there something about the nature of AI algorithms, at least as they're constructed today by the AI industry, that kind of, just drives towards this kind of like racialization and discrimination? Or, what do you think about this kind of resurgence of eugenics and phrenology that we're seeing?
I think it really comes back to this notion of predictable deviance, right? That there's this idea that there's a perfectly ordered society in which corporations occupy a particular echelon together with states that, may be secondary or maybe, tertiary even. It sort of depends on who you ask in the tech sector. But in which, like, unless you can predict deviance and you can predict who is going to stand in the way, as it were, and mess with that order, you can't really impart your vision of what the world ought to look like. And I think a lot of, unfortunately, the tech sector and the giga tech companies, as it were, often think about the future as one in which there is almost perfectly predictable order, where you can predict climate change and where you can simply use an AI tool to solve various deeply complex problems. And with that comes a particular set of normative understandings of human behavior that are deeply rooted usually within a Western understanding and within a Western white Anglophone understanding of how people ought to be, and that anything that falls either side of that, or left or diagonally or what have you, is in some ways other and should be considered a problem. And we see, in even some of the, like, I'd say, like, in the sort of mid-2010s, there were experiments with lie detection using phrenology and physiognomy and facial recognition. And it was basically hearkening back to the early days of eugenics. Like, could you look at people's facial expressions and figure out what a baseline of truthfulness is, and based on their facial expressions and based on their face shape, make out whether they're lying to you about where they're coming from when they're transiting through third countries. Is an attempt to really prove when, say, an asylum seeker is coming through, that when they're saying that they're from Syria and where they're telling you they're from Gaza, and where they're telling you, they're from Somalia, that they really are from there, and that if the AI is telling you that they're wrong or that their face glitched in a particular way, and it may well have be seen as a glitch because it was trained on white training data, that it was based on training data that was rooted in a very Western normative understandings of what different expressions mean, that somehow that means that they're deviant and they're a problem. And I think crucially, it comes down to this faux understanding that there is a baseline of emotionality that's expressed in a particular way in our faces, that you can be scientifically perfectible and readable. And I think not to, get all wishy-washy and hippy-dippy on this, but there is something that's profoundly unknowable about humans and how we interact with the world and culture around us, depending on where we are, who we are, how we grow up. And computer scientists, I should say tech bros, don't get this, yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between those three categories, and I won't get into that right now. But I think we see that play out, and we see it play out as an alibi. Instead of having to talk about engagements with eugenics as a serious undertaking today, we can just talk about facial recognition. We can talk about emotion recognition. We can talk about gait recognition, gender detection, race detection. Hell, I went to a conference a couple of years ago, surveillance exposition, I promise I'm done soon, and they said that they could detect your gender using just one image of you. And you walk in front of this camera and it tells you entirely the wrong thing. And you're asking them, why can't this tell me what I am? You just told me this was like the latest in the industry. And they'll tell you, right now we're using the proxy of your hair length and your height in order to determine your gender. In 5 years, though, we'll be able to do this for real. They're selling this right now. But it's so interesting, right? Because you wonder, what is it about gender that a human can differentiate? We can't even do this. And we, at best, might well use hair length and height as myopic as that is. And the fact that these companies really sell their snake oil on this notion that they can do these things on observable scientific fact about these measurable things about you itself tells you everything that you need to know about the industry.
Yeah. And, we can laugh at it, but it also has serious consequences. Yep. And it plays out also in the realm of predictive policing, which I know that you have an article coming out about, now, today? Do you want to
in 4 hours, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that article?
Yeah, so we sued the New York Police Department about 4 years ago now, on the back of them having used facial recognition against a Black Lives Matter protester, a guy named Derek Ingram. He was protesting after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And he was harassed by police officers outside of his apartment for 4 hours under the auspices of having used a megaphone too close to an officer's ear, which apparently counted as violence. He just happened to be the only black guy in that area that had been identified by facial recognition by the NYPD. That is the only crime he committed. There was no warrant. They showed up at his flat. They harassed him for 4 hours, and a journalist was able to find a printout that one of the officers was holding that said facial identification report on it. And that's how we knew that facial recognition had been used against him. The police continued to try and push for a case against him for violence against the police. How did this just go off? Apologies. Oh, it's back. And, we tried to find out why they had targeted Derek and who else might have been targeted in the process. We were hearing at the time stories about people being falsely arrested in Detroit and Chicago and New Jersey, in particular black folk being falsely arrested, right? We know that the bias rates in these facial recognition algorithms, vary anywhere between 30 to 60 to 92%, depending on what communities you're looking at in the particular tool in question. And what we were able to assert was that there was no way through freedom of information requests that the NYPD or any other police force was going to give us information about how they were using these tools or why they were targeting people. We knew that it was warrantless, and that's all we had to go on. But we mapped cameras across New York City, found about 25,000 of them that plug into facial recognition, and we're able to look at how, in particular, communities that have more black and brown community members had walls of these facial recognition cameras around them, and that they were subjected to them. That upwards of 100% of the areas that Black Lives Matter protesters would have protested at were actually subject to exposure to facial recognition, and used that to sue the NYPD, who were then forced to give us about 2,700 documents showing us how they'd use facial recognition against communities of color. And what we found, and this is probably the first time this is being said, so don't spread it too widely, is that people were targeted on the basis of speaking a Middle Eastern language. People were targeted on the basis of wearing clothes that looked a little bit weird. There were 3 men that were standing at the New Year's Eve ball drop, and they weren't dancing, and so that is suspicious. One of them went off to the toilet and spoke a foreign language. These are the reasons why people have facial recognition used against them. One person was arrested on the back of facial recognition for having written "fuck the police" on his Twitter. A second person was arrested and apprehended on the basis of saying New York City is the bomb. That one is a bit arbitrary and weird and not necessarily racialized, but you see the theme that comes up and again. It's a preemptive move towards stopping racialized people from just existing and engaging in expression.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to audience. So, if you want to have a little bit of a think of anything you might want to ask our guests, now's the time to do it. So, lastly, let's turn a little bit to artificial intelligence and military power. So today, we see kind of AI effectively becoming, what some people call dual-use technology. Where algorithms that might be used for, ordinary things like you were saying earlier, targeted advertisement, kind of these recommender algorithms, so to speak, are also at the same time, used in military contexts, including in the genocide in Gaza. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. I know I think you've both done quite a bit of work on this. One thing is there's the specific algorithms that were deployed by the Israeli army. I think it was last year that the article came out about lavender, which was a kind of AI algorithm that surfaced Hamas targets, or supposed Hamas targets, surfacing 37,000, I think, targets in the first week of the conflict alone. And then that was paired with another algorithm called Where's Daddy, which was a geolocation algorithm to geolocate these supposed targets in their homes in order to strike them more easily, and of course leading to the wipeout of entire families. So, there's a few things we could go into there, which is like, what is the role of AI in that context, really? What is it doing? And I'm thinking here especially what you were saying earlier, Alia, about that its prime function really is being able to circumvent kind of accountability. And I think there's some interesting dynamics in relation with the kind of legal structures as well that we can go into. And then the other question that I wanted to ask is, that's kind of the algorithms themselves, but there's of course an entire infrastructure supporting those algorithms, which is where, big tech really comes into the picture when it comes to the genocide. So if you could both speak a little bit to that and just lay out what's been going on.
It's like where to begin. It's like, I think, so maybe I can speak to this a bit more from like a personal perspective, because I am Palestinian, my family are from Gaza, and one thing that I found really just like really jarring when the article came out about lavender was actually the way that people in our space would talk about it as if like, oh, well, that explains like why the killing has happened at this rate, and like why, and it was like, actually, no, it doesn't. Like, the system of apartheid, settler colonialism, like these things explain why, because just because the AI tells you something, you also don't have to do it. And I think that was like a really, for me, it was like a really enlightening moment in understanding like even good people and people who are in our space, who are, much respected and loved colleagues, will try to like turn away from the reality of like the kind of racism that has underpinned Israel's treatment of Palestinians since 1948 until today. And I think that was really surprising to me, and I think that was also one of the functions of the AI. And we've already talked about this like ability to evade responsibility, to not really have to interrogate what you're doing. I think that really came across, and actually, in a way, it was like a gift to some of Israel's allies, because they could be like, oh, it's just the AI. Like, they probably didn't mean to do it, and, they would act completely differently if the AI was different. And totally, it's totally false, like, I think. And the other thing just about that I have thought of often since that came out, and actually throughout a lot of the reporting about the use of tech in the genocide, is that it really creates this idea of Israel as this like amazing like tech power, like so strong and independent. And actually it again hides the fact that Israel could not do any of this stuff, like could not use any of this tech, could not drop any of these bombs without the complicity and the active support of other states and of companies, like Google, which runs Nimbus, like Amazon, which has now said, we'll take over the cloud services. It cannot do those things without that support. But I think the focus on tech in this case is a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think it really feeds into this like idea that like Israel's so big and strong and it's really like unstoppable. And actually it's very stoppable. Like, that's why, okay, I have to say brackets, not speaking as an Amnesty person right now, close brackets, but like that's why the BDS movement calls for the targeting of complicity, because if we target those things, we can stop these atrocities and we can stop, the genocide. And so I think it creates this like mystical layer over Israel, which really actually not there if you lift the curtain a little bit. But that's, my reflections more, I guess, from like a personal like or organizer perspective. I'm sure you have more detail.
Well, maybe you could explain a little bit what Nimbus means.
Oh, sorry.
Like, yeah. So when we say Google was running Nimbus, for example, what does that?
So some of you will have heard of Nimbus. It is a cloud marketplace, basically. It's a cloud platform that's provided by Google and Amazon Web Services that enables the Israeli MOD, as well as a bunch of other departments within the Israeli government, to have access, unrestricted access to a number of different APIs, a number of different programs that Google and Amazon are making readily available for Israel, as well as a number of other third-party applications, including, for example, applications by Palantir that are served to Israeli authorities via Google Nimbus. What's interesting about Nimbus as a project is, as I'm sure some of you will have seen in the reporting from, I think it was last week, Yuval Abraham's latest, in which the wink mechanism was introduced, right? In which there's a clear stipulation within the contract. If you haven't seen a contract yet, go dig it up. It's really disturbing. In which if a foreign court asks Google or Amazon to show them any data or show them what they've done with respect to due diligence or otherwise, that they ought to immediately notify the Israeli authorities. And also, it clearly stipulates that Israeli authorities are allowed to make unrestricted modifications and use of any of the tools and mechanisms available via Nimbus. So, you can't, as Google and Amazon claim, which typically these companies, especially cloud manufacturers, do, that, we don't control how our clients use our tools. Because they do, and very much Israel set the terms for that. And so when we're talking about Nimbus and when we're talking about big tech in the context of Gaza, what we're talking about is an opportunistic angle towards the settler colonialism, the apartheid, and the genocide that's now been ongoing, that Silicon Valley actively embroiled itself within. It saw an opportunity, a case in which racialized groups of people who have experienced domination and apartheid and illegal occupation since 48, saw themselves subjected to these powers, and the Silicon Valley industry basically went, here's an opportunity for us to provide security tools, provide tools for this government to continue scaling its operations. Now, the important thing that Alia pointed out here is that it's not scaling up the actual operations per se. What we're witnessing in many ways is, again, an opportunistic engagement with trying to benefit off of the narrative that this is a place in which targeted warfare, in which precision warfare, in which the elimination of Hamas terrorists and combatants does happen, in which wars that are really a clash of civilizations are winnable, and therefore tech companies ought to be on the right side of history, which to them is on the side of Israel, right? And so when we see them getting involved in these spaces is in part because it is for them a civilizational struggle, in addition to being a struggle for marketing themselves as the company that can help you advance future warfare. And I think this is the other side of that double-edged sword with Lavender and Where's Daddy and Gospel, is that whenever we see an article that exposes these systems, we're also seeing a promotion of exactly this narrative that Israel is technologically superior, that they are conducting warfare in a technocratic and deeply technically sophisticated and detailed way. And as our friend of ours, Nadine, says, it's not that Israel is technologically superior, it's that they're criminally superior. You're watching different iterations and narratives that justify movements that are rooted in exactly the structures that Alia was talking about before, but that are using AI washing to justify it, to shield it, to make you forget about it. There's a particular aspect of international humanitarian law that says that you must have a legitimate target when you're engaged in a strike, and that the individuals that you are targeting must be directly participating in hostilities. If an AI tells you that there are 36,000 combatants, those are directly participating in hostilities. They must be. The AI told me it's a combatant.
Yeah.
And so that creates, again, the idea that, oh, shoot, not only are they really technically sophisticated, but their AI can do international humanitarian law for us? Great. We never have to worry about this again. So it becomes really just a site for the export of technologies, target acquisition technologies that have been developed in Israel, as well as a site for becoming involved in both a civilizational struggle and a struggle for war-based techno-capital that, your Googles and your Amazons and your Microsofts of the world actively participate in.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us for the second session in this discussion series. There will be a third and fourth session happening next year. The dates will come out fairly soon. The session today, I know, was a lot, also in terms of just kind of the sheer heaviness of how the kind of intersection of technology and power is playing out today, but it really was a session that was focusing on the kind of crux of the matter, really the frenzied concentration of power that's happening around, especially artificial intelligence right now. So thank you for sitting through that. The next session is going to focus on what are we doing about it. We are going to be looking at labor organizing, student organizing, and we're going to take the lens that this is not a blocker on innovation technology. This is the fundamental requirements for working tech, for innovation that is actually innovation, for innovation that actually serves people, and that's what these types of organizing is actually about. So a huge round of applause. Thank you guys so much for joining us.